Right, so welcome everybody again for the final time, and we'll try and make a start as soon as possible. Are you with us, Andrew?
Hello.
Hi, good. Right, a couple of things first before we get going with the talk. Please make sure that everybody keeps themselves muted and their videos turned off. The talk is being recorded and will be up on YouTube in due course, but it's really important that everybody keeps muted. The second thing we use, for those who haven't been to one of our talks before, you're all able to put your questions to Andrew, and I have a feeling there's going to be rather a lot. Use the chat function as we go on. So if a question occurs to you during the course of the talk, just put it into the chat, and we have somebody, Rob, who will be taking those down and passing them on to me. I will then put the questions to Andrew right at the end. And that's pretty much all I have to say, except to remind everybody that our following talk booking is open for that's Journey to Britannia, Thursday the 8th of December, by Bronwyn Riley. If anybody hasn't actually read her book, it's a good read, but it'll be well worth attending the talk anyway. Right, without any further ado, I'm going to ask Andrew to make a start. Just one quick little word about what we're talking about this evening. At least some of the detail in his talk is from his PhD research. And what isn't perhaps well known is that he has a book just about ready to come out, I think, Andrew, isn't it?
Just out.
Oh, it is out. Okay.
I might do a plug for it.
Oh, well, you do the plug then rather than me. I know that BAR have done a bit of publicity about this talk, so plugging themselves as well in the process. Right, with no ado, further ado, I'm going to hand over to Andrew. He can do his plug and then get going.
So Dave, do you want to stop sharing your screen so I can pop up the slides? There we go. Hopefully you could all see that.
Yeah, we can see that. Great.
Great. So good evening, and I'll just start by saying happy Thanksgiving, because I know we've got a few people who will be celebrating, so it's great that you're able to take a bit of time away from your day and join us on this exploration of Roman Scotland. So tonight I'm going to be focusing on some of the most recent research that I've been doing, which has been looking at the roads and rivers in Scotland and the relationship that these had with Roman fortifications in 1st century Scotland. So my wider research has been looking at the positioning of the early Roman fortifications in the landscape, so where they built them and why. I'll touch on that a little bit later on, because it's quite crucial to understanding what was happening with the early road and river networks. So I'm going to be starting with a brief overview of the 1st century, so what we know and probably more crucially what we don't know, and then I'll give a bit of an overview about the road network, and again what we know and what we don't know about that, along with a few examples, and then I'll just touch on the river networks and what we know about how the Romans were using those back in the day. I should just say this cover slide is Bertha Roman Fort just north of Perth. We'll come back to that one later, but it just gives you an idea of what we're going to be talking about. So before we get into the detail, it's important to give some background information on Scotland during the Roman period, as this kind of influences and shapes both our knowledge and how we interpret what was going on. So there were 3 main Roman invasions of the area we now know as Scotland. Scotland itself wasn't established for another 1,000 years or so after the first Roman invasion. And in the earliest Roman times in Britain, the main part of Britain, which was under Roman rule, was known as Britannia, with the north often referred to as Caledonia, although the exact boundaries aren't known and may have moved as the army gradually occupied and secured new territories. But tonight I'll keep things easy and just refer to Scotland, meaning the land north of Hadrian's Wall, north of the modern border with England. So the first invasion took place, first invasion of Scotland, I should say, took place during the reign of the Flavian emperors. So that's around 77 to 86, 90 AD in the first century. And this is known as the Flavian period. And the troops then were led during their invasion by the governor of Britain at the time, Agricola. And I'll come back to him shortly, but here he's depicted on the right there, quite a mean looking guy. There is some slight evidence, mainly from Perthshire, of Roman activity before the Flavian period in Scotland. That's quite controversial, not something I'm going to go into tonight. So after the troops were withdrawn in the first century, there wasn't another invasion until the reign of the Emperor Antoninus Pius. That's around 139 to 165 AD. And that's when he abandoned Hadrian's Wall, built his own wall across central Scotland. Very roughly, very roughly, that's between Edinburgh and Glasgow. I should briefly mention there is some evidence of activity during the reign of Hadrian in Scotland. Primarily, this is just north of Hadrian's Wall, and that's at Biron's Roman Fort in Dumfries and Galloway. It was most probably an outpost used as a base for campaigning and military operations. Third invasion of Scotland took place in the 3rd century under the Emperor Septimius Severus. This was essentially a campaign of genocide. It was a reaction to incursions into Roman territory from indigenous tribes in the north, and the emperor wanted it sorting, Roman style. And the way he dealt with that was for the emperor himself to come over, lead a substantial military force into Scotland to crush all opposition. Unfortunately for him, though, he dropped dead halfway through the campaigns and it was abandoned shortly after. We're not really going to cover that invasion tonight because we just don't have the time. And there's probably, as well, just to touch on it, probably subsequent Roman expeditions into Scotland after the Severn campaigns and possibly between the 3 invasions. But if they did happen, it's not very clear in the archaeological record. So again, we're not really going to touch on that tonight. So I'm going to move on to discussing some of the issues and challenges that we face when looking at Roman Scotland. There's an excess of 300 known Roman sites across Scotland, and there are many more suspected sites, probably at least 150, that we just don't know what is going on. That's sort of represented on that map on the left, a lot of possible and probable sites. Quite a few of the sites, such as Bona on Loch Ness, which is number 1 way up in the top there, that's probably almost certainly not Roman. Quite a few of the sites in Perthshire and Angus, so around this area, they probably are Roman because they're in close proximity. But almost all of these locations on that map are some sort of archaeological site, but we just can't be certain if they're Roman or not. They could be later, they could be earlier than the Roman invasion, but they show some of the signs of Roman fortifications. So some of the sort of crop marks turning up look like they could be Roman, but basically we need to do a lot further work on the ground to confirm what these sites are. If they are Roman, and as I say, many of them undoubtedly are, we need to look for evidence that gives us an indication of which of the 3 Roman invasions they belong to. Dating is very important, but even that comes with its own set of challenges. I won't go into these in any depth tonight because we just don't have the time, but it's important to know that Roman sites in Scotland are generally identified through 5 different methods. Some of them can be used to date a site on its own, but others rely on corroboration. So you basically need 2 methods to really say with any certainty that they're Roman. First one is scientific dating. Now that requires organic material that can be analysed to give a date. So things like radiocarbon dating. Usually to uncover materials like that, you need to do excavation. And that's a lot of sites there that need excavating. So that one, whilst it is very good and fairly accurate in most instances, is not the easiest one to do. Next type of method are finds. So things like pottery, glass, or coins. These can give a date that someone has occupied or been at a site. One of the challenges with that is that if you find a coin on the ground, it's what we call out of context. So did someone drop it anytime after the Roman period, or has it been ploughed out from the field that it's in? So unless it comes from what we would call a sort of secure stratigraphic context, it's very difficult to use those on their own to date a site, but it's complex. Third method we have are site entrances, and this mainly applies to Roman camps. So there are different designs of entrances that are in use at different periods, and these can be helped to use to date a site. So that's those images in the top right. The next method I would describe as morphology. It's similar to entrances and how we date those, but applies to the overall shape or style of a fortification. Not all forts and camps are that traditional playing card shape, and they're not all the same size. It depends on how big the force staying in them was, how big they made the site. Scholars have attempted, excuse me. Scholars have attempted to group those sites that are similar in size or have different attributes, group them together, assuming that they belong to a particular campaign or construction unit. So the final method is what I would call proximity, and it's the least secure method of dating. And it assumes that if one site is known to date to a particular period through one of the other methods, then an adjacent site is quite likely to also date to that time. Now, a lot of Roman sites are built together, so you could have a fort and a camp next to each other, and it's assumed that they build the camp, and when they're living in the camp, they then build the fort. It's the least secure method because it makes assumptions that there are two sites in the same place being occupied at the same time, and it really does need corroboration from one of the other methods to give us any sort of educated guess on that. So just to sum up, this pie chart shows the methods that have been used to date first century sites in Scotland. We've got around 30 forts. Most of those have been excavated one way or another quite a while ago for most of them. And from those, finds are primarily used to date the site. So we can be fairly confident that we know the forts date to the 1st century. Only one fort and about 3 camps have been excavated in recent decades and dated using scientific methods, radiocarbon dating. So again, we can be fairly sure about those sites. But the remaining sites have generally been dated using the other methods. And I think it's fair to say that the dating of these is really down to what we would call an educated guess. And for this research, I'm making the assumption that the dating of most of the 1st century sites is correct, but that comes with the caveat that there needs to be much more research on the matter. So tonight I said we're going to be focusing on 1st century Scotland, and I need to give you some of the background on the period, and that's why this is really important for this research. So, as I mentioned earlier, Scotland, or the area north of the Roman province of Britannia, was invaded around the mid-70s AD in the latter part of the 1st century. Up until this point, there had been a sustained movement north of Roman forces with the establishment of a frontier or a border of sorts in northern England, probably taking the form of a series of towers more or less across the Pennines, generally following the route of the A66 through Stainmore, which links Penrith and Scotch Corner. Roman Roads Chair Mike, who you saw at the beginning, did a very good talk on that a few months ago about those sites, and it's up on the website, and I'd recommend having a look at that because he makes some very important points in it. So by around AD 72-73, dendrochronological evidence, such tree ring dating, has shown that the fort at Carlisle was under construction, and shortly after that, we assume the army began its invasion of what we call Scotland now. We're lucky enough to have a surviving Roman text which details that period of campaigning, and I'm sure some of you have heard of it. It's called the Agricola, and it was written by Tacitus over here on the right. It's essentially a eulogy or a memorial piece detailing the exploits of his father-in-law, the Roman governor, Julius Gnaeus Agricola, on the left, and his time as governor in Britain. It is not a verbatim account of everything happened, and it is not wholly accurate. There is some exaggeration in it, intended to make Agricola look like a brilliant general, and at times there are inaccuracies, but we've also got to remember it was never intended by the author to be a true and accurate biographical account, particularly as it was written after the campaigns took place and possibly even after Agricola's death. So instead, we really need to view it as a propaganda piece. The Agricola is an important and influential text, and it was rediscovered around the 16th century. And much of what is known or assumed to be known about Scotland in that period is based on that text. So I'll give you an example. There's a general assumption that much of the campaigns detailed in the Agricola took place in Scotland. However, the text itself details very few geographical locations, plenty of descriptions of battles on hillsides, campaigns in Caledonia, forests, but we don't know where any of this took place except that it was beyond Roman territory, so probably north of the Pennines. Two of the only geographical locations mentioned in the text are the Bodotria and the Clota. These are described as inlets or river mouths that stretched far inland. And there's really been an assumption by everybody that that refers to the Firths of Forth and Clyde, but we have to remember this is speculation, and a lot of it is based on a Victorian translation of the Agricola that kept being revised. And there is some people who think that it could refer to the Solway and Tyne, the latter being more of an estuary than a river mouth before industrial development. So that's Newcastle, for those who don't know. This is a map of the 96 locations in Scotland where first century Roman fortifications are to be found. Some of those locations have more than one Roman site. So in actuality, there are over 120 fortifications which are confirmed or very likely to date to the first invasion. I should probably also point out that there are 5 types of fortification in use in Scotland at this time. A legionary fortress at Inchtoothal, which is 15 on the map, so just about there. That acted as the overall command HQ in the north. The next nearest one was York. So we're building a new base in Scotland. There are forts. These are permanent regional bases. There are camps, which are temporary bases. Fortlets, which are very small mini forts, which are designed to guard sections of the road and river crossings. And there are also 2 tower networks. I'm not going to cover those tonight. So what do we know about the road network in the north? So we start by talking about the nationally held data. I actually should probably mention before that a lot of the routes in Scotland were probably established in the 1st century, although it's quite likely those were in use before the Romans arrived. Then they withdrew and came back in the 2nd century, and that's when these routes were all formalized and upgraded to look more like sort of traditional images of Roman roads, so sort of stone tracks. I do tend to use the word road when I'm talking about something quite physical, and I talk about routes when we don't know what was there, whether it was a mud track or maybe something more formal. Should also say that there are different categories or quality of Roman roads in Britain. In Wales, we've identified that there are tracks and there's the more formal roads, and we seem to be getting that in Scotland. I mean, that's a very simplistic way of putting it. It's quite a bit more complex, as we'll come on to. So in Scotland, we're very lucky to have a national database of archaeological and historical information, which is held by Historic Environment Scotland, which is the Scottish equivalent of Historic England, formerly Historic Scotland, and the Royal Commission on Ancient and Historic Monuments of Scotland, who merged. Anyway, the database itself is known as CAMMORE, and it's freely accessible to everybody. And CAMMORE provides certain data sets which can then be processed through computer software known as Geographic Information Systems, or GIS. And that's what I've used to do a lot of modelling about Scotland in the 1st century. And I'll come back to more of my research shortly. But CAMMORE itself is a wonderful resource for researchers, and it really does help because it has individual records of each site. There are other sites that bring in more regional data, but it's all a great resource for scholars such as myself. So, for example, if you look at the record for the Roman fortress at Inchtoothal, the CAMMORE record would detail any visits by Historic Environment Scotland or their predecessors to the site, what they observed, anything about the condition. They'll have a look at certain features, and they note all this in a record, and they tend to include a partial bibliography. It's not a replacement system for proper research. And indeed, some of the records can be out of date and inaccurate as interpretation changes and more data is gathered, but it's a great starting point for research, but you do have to check all the details in it. We do have to be cautious when basing conclusions on that data for those reasons, because some of it can be misleading. And some of it is based on inaccurate data and assumptions that, as I say, have changed and evolved. And this is particularly pertinent for Roman roads. And I'll show a number of examples of those shortly, but I wanted to show you this one, which is particularly challenging. So this is the road network in the 1st century. Those are the 1st century sites. And in the center here, we have Loudon Hill. Now that's a Roman fort that was partly excavated middle of the 20th century and was destroyed by quarrying in the 1950s. There's also some indication of 2nd century activity on the site as well. On the right, we've got a bit of a double road here. And on the left, we've got this incredibly long straight line that just ends here on the coast. Now, the reality is most of this is speculative. A probable route on the eastern side here has been traced, but it's not been tested on the ground. On the left, this straight stretch does not exist. We don't know what's going on there or what that is. This is someone has made a bit of a guesstimate on where the road would go. No Roman road is ever that straight in Britain, and I don't think anywhere in the Roman Empire. So, as I say, can be misleading. We do have to check what's behind these decisions and how people came to these conclusions. Give you another little example along the same lines. This is Castle Gregg Fortlet. It's very remote. It's fairly in the middle of nowhere. There are no other Roman sites to the north within a day's march, so 15 to 20 miles. This section of road, again, is speculation. It's not been tested on the ground. There's been some indication that there may be something there, but this stretch is fairly hypothetical, although it is more than likely there is a stretch of road there. We've just not found it, so we can't be quite sure that it's going in that direction or it's that straight. I know there's been some very recent work on Castle Gregg by the team at Hess, so they may have found a few things out, but this is slightly older data. This isn't just restricted to the national database. Most local authorities in Scotland have their own regional historic environment record databases, and these too can include fairly inaccurate records of Roman roads. Quite often they can be unverified, but they can be problematic. I'll come back to that in a second, because I'm going to mention slightly divergence into other challenges that we have with Roman roads. As I say, they're not all straight, despite popular belief. The way they're constructed is generally in straight sections, but they do move around features in the landscape. It's very important to remember this for Scotland. I'll come back to that in a second. But we do, when we're trying to identify Roman roads, we take into consideration a number of factors. when looking at them in the landscape. The first is where the road is going to and from. So is it running between any known Roman sites? Secondly, we look at the design of the road. Does it have a camber or an agger, which is the raised mound in the center? So in this photo on the left, it's sort of this bit that enables the water to run off into drain. And are there drainage ditches? We also have to look at the surface. Now, don't read too much into this picture on the left, because it's kind of a bit of an idealized Roman one. Roman roads in Scotland tend to have larger stones in the bottom and then thinner stones on the top, metaling. So we have a look at all these. We also need to think about the width. Most Roman roads are at least 4 meters wide. So we have to take all that into account when we think we've identified a Roman road. And even if a road has all these features, we have to be cautious in declaring it Roman, because most major roads constructed after the Roman period, certainly in Scotland, do share most of these features. So the other thing we look for are quarry pits. These are basically holes dug next to a road where pebbles can be extracted to surface the road. If we find those, we can be fairly certain that the road is Roman. But we also need to bear in mind they don't always need to find those stones from digging. They can find them lying on the ground. They can find them from rivers. There's on this LiDAR image from Mike that I've taken from the Roman Roads website, you can see some of the quarry pits showing up in that image. This is a laser scanned LiDAR, an aerial laser scanned image. And it's one of the ways, the modern techniques we use to detect Roman roads. Lots of information on the Roman Roads Association website to find out about that. So another challenge we have, as I said, post-Roman period, they tend to build roads very similarly. They're not as good a quality, but it's very difficult to tell that unless you actually excavate. Medieval roads are very easy to confuse with Roman roads, particularly when they tend to be very similar and following the same route. But the other issue we have in Scotland is that we have something called the Turnpike Acts. These are very surface description. These are laws from about the 16th century onwards, which encouraged landowners to create toll roads across their land. So create a road running between two short points and then charging people to use those roads. They can be very straight and are very often mistaken for Roman roads because they share, again, many of the same features. So it does make it very difficult for us as archaeologists and scholars to be clear on which roads are Roman or not, which may have been Roman and have been improved upon or built on top of. So it is a very complex picture, and it often does need archaeological work, excavation, metal detecting to try and clarify what's going on. So can we come back to some of that information I was talking about that's found its way into databases and why it's problematic. So in 1747, a Copenhagen-based professor, Charles Bertram, published a book. It is known as De Situ Britanniae. Bertram claimed, it was originally written in the 14th century by a monk, who in turn had translated a lost Roman book. So you get the idea there's a bit of a chain going on that's fairly untraceable. Little notice was given to that book until a guy called William Stukely around the 1750s started to promote it. Now, Stukely had written one of the first books on Roman Scotland, and he was taken quite seriously by some of the leading academics of the day. And that book kind of took off because of his influence. Now, that was despite claims, I think the earliest claim was around 1856, that De Situ Britanniae was a forgery. Most scholars today continue to believe it is a forgery that was written by Bertram himself. And as with any successful or good lie, there are some truthful elements in the book. And that comes because Bertram used some known Roman texts when making up his forgery. The claims in Bertram's book found themselves into subsequent successful books on historical antiquities, particularly a lot of the books on antiquarian books on Roman Scotland. Some of the people that include his information are Maitland, Pennant, and Chalmers. They're For those that know, these are quite big, prominent books within Roman archaeology in Scotland. This map is from 1887, an 1887 Chalmers volume, based on an earlier 1807, I think it is, volume that he wrote. And it includes a number of unconfirmed sites and a section of Roman road which appears to be made up. So this is the Firth of Forth, so Edinburgh would be around here. This road is supposed to be Roman. There's meant to be a Roman site here, a Roman site here, Roman site here, and it carries on up to where Aberdeen is. And the road continues beyond Aberdeen up into Moray. Now, we do know there are Roman sites up there. Some of these sites may be confirmed, unconfirmed. Fordoun probably isn't. Can't quite remember which one is because we've got several sites around there. This could refer to a Roman camp at Dun, which is actually here. This is the Montrose Basin. Basically, he's mixing reality and forgery to come up with something that subsequent people are using in their books. This has sort of been perpetrated and continued, and a lot of these false records enter into the environmental records that are still used today because they're based on older data and information. So no one's to blame as such. It's just something that's creeped in and something that probably needs to be developed and sorted out further. We quite often find that in northeast Scotland, Aberdeenshire, Angus, there are sections of this track, there are sections of track that are dug up when people are ploughing fields or whatever, and it goes into the historic environment record as being Roman because it's based on one of these older texts. I'm not saying there aren't Roman roads in these areas. Some of the records may be correct, but we cannot assume anything. And to be honest, a lot of the information has made its way into more recent books on Roman roads, such as Margery. And it has found, some of it's found its way into the Canmore data and various other sources. So we need to be looking at that, and we need to take any mention of a Roman road with a pinch of salt. So before we look at some specific examples of roads, I wanted to give you a quick summary of the research I've been doing and how this all fits together in the landscape. So as I say, I undertook computer modeling of various Roman fortifications in the landscape setting using latest topographical mapping data from Ordnance Survey, and then plotting individual Roman sites into the database. Now, I've analysed in excess of 120 sites, and the evidence suggests that first century Roman fortifications are built in places which enable them to control movement through the landscape, or movement routes. So in other words, fortifications were built at the entrance to or places where they overlooked valleys, because this is where the indigenous population was moving through the landscape from getting to one place to another. Here are two examples to show you what I mean. On the left is Crawford Roman Fort in South Lanarkshire. It's placed overlooking the main north-south route from Carlisle to Scotland, the Clyde Valley. The fort is facing south, so there's a little arrow on it. It's facing down this way. So that would enable the soldiers to keep an eye on who is approaching, but it also blocks a route to the east. So Cadm Wood, we believe, is an Iron Age fort, so contemporary with the Roman occupation of the area. There is no way out of this valley except to go down, follow this river valley to the main route where Crawford Fort is. On the right, we've got the fortified gatehouse of Fleet. That is guarding a crossing point over the river. It's also guarding the river valley, the north-south route, and would enable them to keep guard of anyone using the crossing or going up and down the river valley. The black line here is the Roman road. It's possibly not quite as accurate as it's appearing in this area because there's some more recent information about that. Interestingly, in both images, the sections of road are listed on Canmore, but mainly they're not confirmed on the ground. As I say, the route at Gatehouse of Fleet, there is some indication there may be an earlier route facing slightly further on the north side. So basically, in the 1st century, and probably in the 2nd century as well, fortifications are protecting or guarding pre-existing movement routes through the landscape. There wasn't a need for the army to build fortifications at every valley or in every point of the country, because everybody was moving through the landscape, and eventually they would come to fortification. Even those that wanted to circumvent that by crossing over hills would eventually have to come down into a valley and would pass a fort. And if not, they'd very much likely pass a Roman patrol. So it would enable the soldiers to keep an eye on the indigenous population, to tax anyone passing by, take whatever they wanted, whether that was people, goods, or money. So it was controlled through both physical presence, but also psychological. These were massive, massive structures that really hadn't been seen before, accompanied by men all dressed very similarly, all marching in uniform under the command of superior officers. All this was very new and very alien. They would have been the subject of stories to the indigenous population, and then suddenly it's on their doorstep. It would have been terrifying. So in the south of Scotland, this is again the Cadm Wood data on the right, we can be fairly certain that these main routes existed and were being used by Romans because they've been traced in large parts on the ground. So this is the Clyde Valley in the west that we've just seen, follows the modern M74. The road runs very nearby, and we've traced large sections of this around about the 1950s. A lot of that was done. On the right-hand side, we've got Deer Street, which heads up this way. But, and there's another problem with the data, the road is not known to exist in this area. A lot of this is speculation. It's likely the road follows the 1st century route, and it was probably developed in the 2nd century, but we're joining dots. So it comes over the hills here, and then it's fairly untraceable. There's a patch around here, there's a patch around here. There's an assumption it all joins up and heads towards the Antonine Wall, so Falkirk area. These spurs are also speculative. We've got a couple of 2nd century Roman forts roughly along here. So the assumption is the road is going to them. It's an educated guess, but a lot of this is under the city of Edinburgh. So it's all educated guesses. A lot of the east-west routes here are not known. Again, it's speculation because there are some Roman sites in these valleys. So there's an assumption that the road is running through there. But again, it's speculative, and we probably do need to do more research on that. I know some people are working on bits and pieces there. So I'm going to show you now a couple of sections of Roman road in the more northern part of Scotland around here. So this section is known as the Gask Ridge. It's a series of fortifications constructed along a road. We're fairly certain that road exists in most places there. This fort is Stregeeth, and there's something quite strange going on there. So we don't know where the road crosses that river. There's several possible locations from aerial photographs that imply there's a complex junction going on. Many of these towers have been excavated, but there's no datable evidence. But the general consensus is that they were active in the 1st century and potentially reoccupied at a later date, either the 1st or 2nd century. The function of this network is not clear. There are some suggestions that it's a signaling network to take messages to the legionary fortress of Inchtoothel, which is off screen by about 3 or 4 miles northeastish of that. Other suggestions include it acting as a secure supply line to move goods through Roman Scotland. It's also been suggested it's a barrier to protect the Roman territory on the southern side around here from anybody attacking from the north. I'm not going to get into all the function of that because that's not what we're here for tonight. But I do want to discuss one particular point, and that's Bertha that we saw at the beginning. It's the site up here, but I'll come back to that in a second, show you some sections of that road. So as you can see, it's still in use today. More southerly is a grass track. It becomes more a muddy track than a farm track, and then it slightly becomes road here, but the road itself probably heads slightly through those fields. Like many other sections of road in Scotland, it appears on maps as a complete route, but the actual course of the road in some places, particularly away from the towers, is unknown, and a lot of it, again, is speculative. So this is Bertha. This kind of marks the most northern edge of the Gask chain of fortifications. So the Gask Ridge is a geographical feature where the bulk of these sites are on, but sometimes people refer to the Gask Ridge as going fairly close to the fortress at Inchtoothal. And I know a few months ago, maybe a year ago, Brigitte Hoffman did a more in-depth talk about this section of road for the association. It's worth watching that one. It's up on their YouTube channel. So I'm not going to repeat what Brigitte covered. Suffice to say that the data on Canmore is very confusing at this section because there are various different bits of road on show. So this is, the road is the Canmore data. We have a bit of road here, we have a bit of road here, we have a fork here, we have a road going here. I think it's probably safe to say that the general consensus is that there probably isn't road quite at this section. A lot of this is under a modern industrial estate, but you've got the River Almond here, and that's quite pivotal. So this point of the River Tay is the tidal range, the maximum tidal range, so you still get a bit of rise and fall with the tide. It's fairly navigable beyond this point by shallow vessels. But what I want to talk about is the crossing here, where the red dot is. It's known as Durders Ford. There are antiquarian accounts that there was a Roman crossing here. So this is meant to be the ford. The road has been traced on geophysical survey roughly in this area. So it does partly account for the difference in the map on the left here. Now, I can also say that this section of road does certainly appear in LiDAR and aerial photographs. There's currently some construction work going on in that area. Hopefully they'll uncover the road. I think they should uncover part of it. We might get some answers. But the aerial imagery talks about the ford. Now, what can I tell you tonight? It's in my book. It hasn't really been published anywhere else. But this ford is very questionable. It only really appears in antiquarian, later 19th century antiquarian accounts. And Crawford, an archaeologist, looked at it in the 1940s and speculated that it wasn't a Roman ford, or that it was a medieval fish trap. That's something I think we can see. This image is from 2018 when water levels were particularly low, and it shows what would be a fish trap. So it's a U-shaped formation of stones. Fish come up with the tide, you put nets across, you catch the fish. Possibly medieval was the speculation. That's something I completely think is accurate. It's too rocky, it's too challenging for carts or anything to get across. Even horses would find it a difficulty. I suspect there was a crossing probably around here. Whether it was a ford or a bridge, I will come back to. It is worth noting there are some anti-tank blocks that originally extended across to stop any German forces sailing further up and landing in this area, which is fairly flat. That could have affected the seabed, the riverbed, and what it looks like. It's also interesting to note that the road is assumed by most archaeologists to be 1st century in origin, but the LiDAR and geophysical survey has indicated that the road at the fort, which is around here, probably runs on top of the fort ramparts. The fort is 1st century. If you put a road on top of it, it kind of implies that that is later. So it could be late 1st century, 2nd century, possibly even medieval. We really need to be doing some excavations there and looking at the relationship between the road and the rampart. Are they quite on top of each other, or are they just missing each other? Have we got some completely different feature? So moving further north yet again into Angus, this woodland here is Cadm or Cadm Wood on the north side of Kirriemuir in Angus. It's a beautifully straight section of ancient trackway running through the woodland that you can see here. It's about 2 miles from the Roman fortifications at Inverquharity, which is to the northeast. But there aren't any other contemporary Roman sites on the southwest of the site. This is looking southwest in this picture. And it seems to have first been noted as being Roman in the early to mid 20th century by Ian Richmond. He told OGS Crawford, who was doing a lot of aerial photographs about it. Crawford visited on the ground, and between the two of them decided that it must be Roman because it had all the hallmarks of a Roman road. However, almost a decade after Crawford had done his analysis, there's a report in the Journal of Roman Studies that disputes this and says there were none of the features usually associated with a Roman road. There was a particular lack of a camber, so the mound in the middle section, and there were no drainage ditches. Now, I visited this section numerous times, and whilst there's nothing there that screams definitely Roman, it does have the hallmarks. It's going to one Roman site. It does have a camber. It's not showing up particularly well in this photo, but along the center here is a camber. It has drainage ditches, as you can see there. You can see one here. It's here, but it is quite overgrown. This is what happens when you go in the autumn and all the trees are down and the vegetation's down. And there's also some evidence, very difficult to see, I'm afraid, of slight stones there, and there are more exposed large stone sections. So I think it's Roman. I think it's Roman, but it's of a better design than the road near Bertha appears to be. That appears to be more of a track, according to Brigitte Hoffman and David Wills-Crotter have studied it. So it has a lot of hallmarks, this section. Is it or isn't it? We need to do more work. However, it is a scheduled monument, which means there's very little you can do other than, as I've done, take some photographs with a ranging rod. You can't do metal detecting or anything like that without getting permission. It's something that we need to think about doing, because if we can start to find hobnail boots, hobnails from Roman soldiers' boots or things like that, it kind of would imply this has been used by the Romans. As I say, a lot of what we know about the Roman road network in Scotland relies on speculation. So we turn to some of the research I've undertaken into waterways in Roman Scotland, again, focusing on the 1st century. It's important to be clear that there is limited archaeological evidence for river usage in Scotland, but that doesn't mean to say it didn't happen. And indeed, elsewhere in the empire, there was extensive river usage from the Tiber in Rome to the Danube in Germany, Central Europe, Dacia, all these places. Rivers were used. Now, in Scotland, of course, our rivers are much less substantial than those examples I've mentioned, but nonetheless, they do offer a pathway to the interior of the country. And of course, many of them are navigable quite far inland. For example, Perth, as you've seen, it still has the furthest inland seaport in the UK, and it's about something like, I think, 20 to 30 odd miles inland from the actual sea at the mouth of the Firth of Tay. And throughout history in Scotland, waterways have been vital for growth, development and warfare, right up into the Second World War, as we saw with the anti-tank blocks. So river usage really only fell out of usage, as it were, in the mid-20th century as other forms of travel became more prevalent. So on the left here, we've got maps of the main river networks in Scotland that have relationships with Roman fortifications, and I'll come back to that in the next slide. These two quotes Both are written in books by Tacitus, his Annals for the top one, and Agricola for the bottom one. And they talk about river usage by the military. The first talks about how the Roman army used rivers to move soldiers and supplies deep into Germany because it was easier and it took soldiers to where the action would be. And the second is related to the campaigns in Scotland and tells us that Agricola used the fleet to monitor and harass indigenous settlements on the coast. And elsewhere in the Agricola, there's suggestions that the fleet was undertaking reconnaissance of the inlets, so the forths. And of course, on the Tay, the tidal range is quite high, and it would be potentially easy for ships to get quite far inland on that waterway, as well as many of the other ones. So thinking about the archaeological evidence, there's little evidence of Roman activities on the rivers in Scotland, but as we say in archaeology, an absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I'm going to briefly mention the River Tweed. We're not going to look at that in any depth. I just want to briefly mention it because probably the most significant piece of archaeological evidence of river usage came from the forts at Newstead, otherwise known as Tremontium, near Melrose and the Scottish borders. This specific area seems to be very important to the Romans because there's quite a few fortifications around that area focused around the river. The bottom right here is known as the Newstead ore, discovered during excavations at the very early part of the 20th century at Newstead. An analysis at the time indicated that it came from a flat-bottomed vessel, similar to this example here on the right. This is Zwammerdam 6, one of 6 original Roman vessels recovered in the mud in the mid-20th century from the Netherlands, the Dutch town of Zwammerdam. It's probably the type of vessel that this paddle oar was used. Now, it was found on a hillside overlooking the river, and it's not clear what exactly was used, but it doesn't seem to have been for a ferry because there was a ford nearby. That may have been replaced by a Roman bridge. So it's quite possible it came from a vessel that sailed between sites on the River Tweed, or one that brought goods in from the North Sea to Newstead, which is about 40 miles on the waterway. Interestingly, though, we haven't found a site at Berk-upon-Tweed, but there are a few around that way. So if you get large seagoing vessels that can reach the coast, they transfer goods to smaller vessels and move inland. The Zwammerdam barges tend to be about a metre deep with their draft, so you wouldn't need a river to have much more depth than that for vessels to access it. River levels in Scotland at this point, we've done very little research on this in the Roman period. There's been a little bit beyond before and after, but nothing specifically in the Roman period. But theoretical approaches and computer modelling all indicate that water levels would have been a bit higher, maybe as little as a metre, probably slightly more than that. And the volume of water flowing from rivers would have been greater. So many of the rivers that aren't quite navigable today may have been more navigable in the Roman period. So looking at the relationship between Flavian sites and the landscape using GIS modelling, the river networks are clearly a key component in the Flavian period. So out of 117 sites analysed, the fortress, 30-odd forts, 57 camps, 4 fortlets, 18 towers, most of those are located near water. It would have been important, of course, for survival, but a lot of these are near larger waterways. As I've mentioned before, sorry, I don't think I have mentioned, but a number of lowland sites, so south of the Forth Clyde, have multiple occupation phases, so Flavian and later activity, and most of the northern sites tend to be single period occupation. So we've got 86% of sites were constructed next to waterways, giving access to fresh water, essential to sustain an invading force, plus all the animals and everybody that goes along with that. But positioning sites on rivers would make them easy to locate if people followed the river valleys. And they're also, as I said, a quick route to the interior which is particularly good for an invading force that had not yet established a significant road network. Although river levels are higher in the Roman period, I'm not suggesting that the army was travelling deep into the heart of Scotland by boat. As I say, many sites could be reached by travelling on the water and flat-bottomed vessels, but it seems unlikely that this was the case for every site. But they may have been following the river valleys. Just briefly as well to mention that there are a number of sites which are constructed near confluences, so where two rivers or more are meeting. It may not be statistically significant, but it's still interesting, particularly if forts are acting as, or camps or fortlets are acting as supply bases within the network. So out of 102 fortifications, 20 forts, 34 camps, 8 fortlets are located within 2 kilometres of the confluence of at least 2 rivers, so almost around a Roman mile. An additional 5, which I haven't included in these figures, are between 2 and 2.5 kilometres from the confluences. We've got to bear in mind that rivers do move over time, so some of them may have been even closer. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. 2 examples of forts by water: Glenlocher in Dumfries and Galloway, and Malling on the Lake of Menteith in Stirlingshire. Interestingly, both of these have what we call annexes. So these are secure compounds which could have been used to store goods brought in by road or water. So this is the annex, that's the outline of the fort, some of the interior buildings, and then these are the sections of annex that we've traced. It's likely this would have been more complete, we just haven't found the rest of it. Malling's slightly different. This is the main part of the fort, and then we have these 2 extensions. There's no end has been traced of the defences there, but it could be under the lake, under the water, or it may have been open-ended because you've got the security of having a massive lake, which would provide quite good defence for a site. Here's 2 examples of forts near confluences. Cargill and Angus, which is a fortlet, and it has a potential annex. We've traced one side of it, and that's on the river side, on the River Isla. That flows into the River Tay. This is the River Tay. You've got Inchtuthil Fortress, probably about half a mile further upriver. And then we have Stracathro on the right. This is the far end of Angus, the far north end. And it's at the confluence of several rivers. The river access here is much more challenging at this point because it is shallow. It is subject to varying water levels whenever there are storms further up in the glens, and it's a lot further from the sea, and the river and the flow isn't the same as something like the Isis, so probably weren't getting much traffic on the river. It's probably people just following that they were going down to the sea. So the last few slides, just want to show you the relationship between the fortifications and the river networks using these diagrams. This is the Firth and the River Tay network. It is in Scotland the most comprehensive and fortified 1st century river network in Scotland. The diagram isn't to scale, it's stylized, but it demonstrates the relationship and proximity of the fortifications on the network. And as can be seen, the forts at Bertha and Cargill are guarding the confluences. So the Bertha and the Almond, Cargill that we've just seen, and the Isis. Not all of these rivers are deep and navigable enough the further up, particularly here at Hunting Tower, Gettington, Macquarie. These are all small burns and streams, but great navigation aid if you need to go between the sites. My research found that at the entrance of most of the rivers are camps, which are essentially controlling access to the water networks. Abernethy is one example of this. It is much closer to the, it's on the River Arn, it's much closer to where it meets the Tay. It's a good sheltered location to bring seagoing vessels in and offloading goods, transferring them to smaller vessels to take them further upriver. There are a few possible Roman sites here that I've not included because they're undated, they haven't been confirmed. So it may even be more complex than that. For those that know the River Erne. There are 18th century records indicating that seagoing vessels were able to access the River Erne as far inland as the Bridge of Erne, and it seems plausible that with higher river levels, some vessels could have reached as far inland as Strageath, possibly even Dalgenross. That's the fort that's near the town of Comrie up towards Crieff. Another piece of archaeological evidence for river activity comes from Bertha that I talked about earlier. There are various antiquarian accounts from the 18th century onwards that describe remains of wooden planks being found in the river. This has been assumed to be remains of a Roman bridge over the Tay. They don't exist anymore. We've not been able to find these planks or the traces of where they were. So it's a bit difficult to say that was a Roman river crossing, particularly given that the track may be on top of the rampart at Bertha. I won't go into all the detail here. It's in the book if you want to look at it further, but we're assuming it's a river crossing, and some of these planks could have come from some sort of dock structure at the water's edge where they transferred the goods. It's certainly a site that leads a lot more investigation in the surrounding area to answer a lot of these questions. So there's not time to look at all the other river networks in Scotland, the Tweed, the Clyde, all up the north coast, the Moray Firth. So I'm just going to show you this other one, which is the Solway Firth in southwest Scotland. There are a number of sites alleged to originate in the Roman period, which we've never been able to confirm. These are in antiquarian accounts. Ayr, up on the coast here, is one of them, and that was always rumours of being Roman. It wasn't actually confirmed until 2018 when they were building some school buildings and they uncovered a Roman camp on the river edge. So there's actually a river, I haven't included it here, and that's where it flows in. So again, Roman sites at river mouths, which seems to be strategically important. Interestingly, the modern A70, A76 follows the valley towards a number of Roman sites, so potentially going from Ayr, and it comes down around here, passing some of these Roman sites to Dumfries. That's the modern road, and in places that does appear to be following a Roman road. So we're kind of Roman roads going between two locations. Around the rest of the Solway coast, there are other sites which are alleged to have Roman origins. Wigton is specifically mentioned, but although there are no confirmed remains there, slightly to the west of the modern town is a Roman fortlet and a possible camp at Bladnoch, where there's also a distillery, very good distillery. Both of the Bladnoch sites are undated, but they demonstrate how complex the archaeology of coastal and river fortifications are. I should also note that I've not included a number of the unconfirmed and undated sites that we know are in the area. They're mainly camps because they've not been investigated, and it isn't quite clear if they're first century later, how it fits in with this broader picture. I should say a lot of this is multiple period, these sites on this map. So our knowledge of Roman activity is very limited, particularly in the southwest here, and the relationship with the roads and the rivers. But like other parts of Scotland, there is clearly a lot more to be learned. And the relationship between the fortifications and watercourses throughout Scotland and the roads is a lot more complex than we've initially imagined. And just to show you here some of those sites and what's the other river networks, can't quite, it's a bit small that. You can see how complex it is and the relationship with the rivers around those. And there, just to put it in a bit of context, is the road map from earlier with the Cadm data. So to conclude, our knowledge of the Roman road network is extremely limited and fragmented, and there's not a huge amount that we can really be certain of. A lot of what we do know is based on educated guesses, particularly for those routes north of those main arterial routes in southern Scotland, Deer Street and through the Clyde Valley. Dating of the road network is also a lot less certain, but we can assume some roads such as Deer Street were in use in the 2nd century, their foundation establishment and the dating of their initial construction is less clear. As we move into North Scotland, the network is more complex, and the dating and even the Roman provenance of some sections is questionable. And we really need to be doing much more work on this to get a clearer picture of what was built and when. Waterways and rivers were in daily use elsewhere in the empire, and there's no reason to think that this wasn't also happening in Scotland. Admittedly, the archaeological evidence is more limited, but probably because we just haven't been looking for it and haven't found it. And a lot of it may not survive, the organic material, wooden structures. Undoubtedly, seagoing vessels visited Scotland. We've got some evidence of anchors, possible Roman anchors found off the coast of Dunbar, the entrance to the Firth of Forth. And it's likely the Roman vessels sailed up the firths and rivers. And there would also have been daily movement along the river valleys, both on the water and following them. This was essential for the Romans to have controlled these networks. And we can also see what they're attempting to do, attempting to control by building fortifications at river mouths and confluences. But we also need to think about, and what we need to explore further, is the relationship between the roads and the rivers. So which came first? Did the Romans invade using pre-existing trackways before adopting those routes? Did they sail to Scotland, move up the rivers, and build fortifications before connecting these sites by road? Or did they use a mixture of both approaches? If you want to learn more about Roman Scotland, my book, Beyond the Empire, is available on Amazon from Robert Hale Publishers. It covers all the known, likely, possible Roman sites in Scotland. I've also done a short guide to Hadrian's Wall that covers all the sites along that. Doesn't really include much bits on Roman roads, and I'll just give another plug for my latest book. It's a lot more in depth and detailed than I've been able to go into tonight. It contains a lot of the computer modeling of sites. It's partly based on my PhD research. It's called Facing the Enemy. It's available from BAR Publishing. They tell me if you sign up to their mailing list, you can get 20% off the cover price for it. So I just want to thank Roman Roads Association for inviting me to speak, in particular the chair, Mike, Dave Armstrong, who has spoken to a lot about the road network, and their Scotland correspondent, Paul Morris. All that has helped inform a lot of this research. And I want to thank everyone else behind the scenes, and of course, everyone for joining us tonight. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That was an absolutely fantastic talk. I'm sure everybody agrees. You can always tell how people regard it by the number that stay all the way through, and you've done better than I did last time, so well done. We have quite a lot of questions, and they're still coming in. Please, if you think of another question, just continue to put it into the chat, and Jim will send it on to me. I'm going to rattle straight into them because there are quite a few. Starting with Zach, who asks, at the start, you noted number one site was in or near Inverness, and that there was nothing north of that. He wants to ask if any evidence had been found further north that might suggest potential Roman sites, or is it just too speculative to say with any confidence?
Right, so there's a bit of a long-winded answer, I think, for this one. There was an archaeologist called Barry Jones, who's dead now, around the 1980s, 1990s, did a lot of flying over of sites, aerial photography, looking for sites on the Moray coast. He identified through crop marks 3 or 4 potential sites, not Bona on Loch Ness. That's completely different. That's an antiquarian account, and it probably refers to medieval or early medieval site. But Barry Jones did a lot of work on the Moray coast. He identified 2 or 3 sites, one Cawdor, so Thane of Cawdor, Shakespeare, in a field fairly close to that. It's also called Easter Galcantry. He speculated about another site slightly north of that. He identified ditches that were, and he went and excavated. And as archaeologists, whenever we do any field work, we have to keep an open mind. We might think something is Roman, such as the roads I've talked about tonight, and then you go and look at it and you think, well, actually, the evidence is against that. Jones excavated at Cawdor and said he found a Roman camp. And quite frankly, it looks nothing like a Roman camp. It's not like any Roman camp we've seen. He uncovered various features, various lumps and bumps, joined a lot of dots, and created probably, said it was Roman, and it was the worst looking Roman camp ever. And I think they would have flogged anyone building something like that. But through Wikipedia and various people that don't know what they're talking about, a myth has been perpetuated that there are sites further north of Scotland. There is no evidence on the archaeology of anything further north. There are a couple of Roman texts. The Agricola says that people sailed round Britain. There's an account of the third century emperor Septimius Severus standing on the edge of Britain and noticing that the days were much longer in the summer than they were in Rome. We don't know where he was standing. Bear in mind, geography in the Roman period was very different from what we have today. So when we get these classical accounts, it's a bit of people inflicting their modern perceptions on things. There may be stuff further north, but there's no evidence. But I wouldn't be surprised if new stuff came out. But anything anyone says today they think is Roman isn't Roman. I've never ever seen anything, and none of my colleagues have ever seen anything beyond the couple of sites in Moray.
Yeah. There's a related question that's just come in, so I'll put it to you now. And it's referring to the Roman fleet apparently circumnavigating Britain in the 1st century. Well, it's under Agricola. Duncan says, it's my understanding that the fleet generally made camp ashore, not sleeping on the ships. So if that's the case, and given sea level changes and the likely ephemeral nature of these temporary camps, might they be usefully looked for in coastal areas of Scotland outside the areas generally thought of as hosting Roman activity? It's a good question, but I'll let you answer it.
No, it's a very good question. And we have one or two partial crop marks that could be Roman that are on the coast. So one of these is just on the northern mouth of the River Tay, just a little beyond Dundee, called East Haven. Green Scrivy or something the farm is known as. And it's a partial camp, and it looks quite possible. And if it is Roman, it's never been properly investigated. If it's Roman, then I think that's a very good case that the fleet are coming ashore and camping there. I'm not an expert on the fleet. I don't know what they did, but I imagine there are situations where it probably was too risky to come ashore. What we've also got to remember is a lot of the east coast, northeast coast of Scotland is quite rocky. There aren't many locations to actually beach because there's so much stone skerries, reefs, as it were, on the coast. But if the fleet did sail around Britain, then they must have camped some places on the coast. We've never seen any evidence. We've never found anything. These are probably the most temporary of encampments, up for a day or two.
Yeah.
Other Roman camps are there for a lot longer. They can be there for a couple of weeks, possibly much, much longer. So they may not have survived. We may not have looked for them. But we've got to come back to why Tacitus is writing. He's saying that Agricola is the best general ever. He's better than the emperor because he conquered Scotland, not the emperor. Emperors go conquering for the prestige. And this guy is saying, my father-in-law was better than the emperor. So they probably did sail around, but we can't say for definite. So, I'm sure they did. They knew Britain was an island, so someone has sailed around it.
Yeah, we could probably talk about that all night, but a lot of questions still to get through. There's at least another 7. From Carenza. Actually, I'm going to change the order of this. We'll go to Paul Kobe's question, because he just mentioned Tacitus. Would Tacitus not have looked foolish if he had substantially distorted the Agricolan campaigns, given that some of his audience would include both senators and their relations who had served in Agricola's army?
It's a good point, but would the relations be reading Tacitus? You know, it's very much designed to impress. And who is, you know, this is a time where there's very little information comes back. You know, the winner does write the history books, and would anybody really know the difference for his intended audience?
There's also a couple of decades time gap between the actual events and when Tacitus wrote it all down, so we have to take that into account as well.
And if we're quite honest, we're not. There is some speculation as to where he got his information from. Was it from Agricola, or had he died at that point? I mean, you don't go challenging the emperor and saying you're better than the emperor, or saying it, you know, one of your family's better than the emperor, without there being consequences. So I think it's a fair question, and we just don't know. I mean, maybe it is completely truthful. Maybe the whole thing's a pack of lies. I mean, we've got some evidence that suggests it may not have been Agricola that launched the first incursions into Scotland.
Yes. Yeah.
It may have been done quite a bit earlier. These Pennine sites could have been established by Agricola. They may have been established 20, 30 years earlier. There's speculation about the Gask Ridge fortifications that they could be much earlier. So archaeology, well, telling the story of Roman Scotland is piecing together a jigsaw, and you have to say the best educated guesses you can in the absence of anything firm. So we always take a Tacitus with a big pinch of salt.
Yes. Going back to Carenza's question, again, it's a good one. Do we have any records of the cartography methods of the Roman armies, or of the people who would or may have been responsible for any possible mapping?
So we do know maps exist in some form. I'm not a specialist in this area, but we know there's slightly later they create a massive marble map of Rome. It still survives in sections. I can't forget the name of that. We know they're surveying. We know the method they're using to build the roads, and I'm sure you've had, I forget his name, that has done a lot of work on the roads. So we know they're doing mapping. They must have maps of something. Sometimes you'll see something called Ptolemy's map of Britain, and it's sort of slightly skewed on the top with Scotland. That's not actually a Roman map. Those are coordinates. A lot of Roman map data that we have today are coordinates that people have subsequently built maps of. On this point, I'm actually going to point Carenza to the Roman Roads website, because you've got lots of great explanations of the various earliest maps that we have. I mean, we've got nothing that survives from Agricola's campaign. Assuming they're making maps, nothing has survived. We've never found anything.
I mean, we certainly know that the Roman army had surveyors. There's no question of that. Each legion had its own mensor, at least one. And if you have surveyors, they are presumably recording what they survey, but how they actually record it, we really don't know. There are various contemporary texts relating to Roman surveying, but they're, again, quite lacking in mapping. There are 1 or 2 recorded maps from the Roman period. There's one from France. We've forgot the name of it, but that's relating to land division, cadastres, centuriation, as some people call it. But that certainly survives. But they're few and far between. We assume there must have been, but a lot of it is assumption. So
I suspect there's an opportunity for someone to study the methods of laying out fortifications in Scotland and maybe building a picture. There's the guy that I mentioned that has looked at how they surveyed Roman roads. Some of his methodology may be applicable to Roman sites, but we don't really know what the landscape was like. Was it all forested? Some of the Roman accounts say it was. Some of the post-first century evidence says a lot of it was cleared. We don't have the environmental evidence from the Roman period, but you're right. You've got surveying teams. It's a group of soldiers. They go out in advance of the main troops, plot the way they want everybody to travel, and then they say, well, we're going to build the fort here. They start to plan it out. But again, we don't know how much are they following existing routes through the landscape, or are they clearing stuff themselves? It's unanswerable, that one at the moment.
I think it's John Poulter is who you were thinking of.
Yes, that's it, John. Yes. He's done a book by, I think it's Amberley History Press.
Yes.
Quite in depth, but worth a read.
It certainly is. Moving on slightly, Des asks, you mentioned 2 tower networks. One's the Gask Ridge, which is the other?
So there's the Gask Ridge is one. There is some indication of a very different type of network in southern Scotland, possibly emanating from Newstead. So there's a tower on the hill at Newstead, and then there's another series of what we think are towers elsewhere in the borders. So they're not close enough to be signaling towers as in I can send you ... dash. They're a little too far away for that, but I would be able to say trouble's coming, light a fire. Some of those towers are questionable if they are towers we think they are. We think they're first century, but there's been analysis of that network that I've done, that one of my other colleagues has done. It kind of implies, it sort of focuses on Newstead. So it's not, there's a very similar, broadly very similar network in Roman Palestine, where there is a very close network of towers and a slightly more spread out one.
There's a related question from Les. You've touched on it. What signalling system would have been used between the towers? It's a pity Birgitte's other half isn't with us, because he could have answered that in about 2 hours. So.
Well, the short answer is Roman signalling, 2010 by David Woolliscroft. If you're really, really interested, that's the book to get. The short answer is they're probably using fires, possibly flags, semaphore. That's possibly it. We don't have any strong evidence to say they're doing that on the Gask Ridge, but we have got evidence that these are methods and hieroglyphs where you flash mirrors. These are used in other parts of the ancient world, so we can speculate. David's book on Roman signalling has all that in the first couple of chapters. Roman signalling by David Woolliscroft. Thoroughly recommend it.
Absolutely, completely agree. I think the reality is they probably use several methods depending on what they needed to convey and the weather.
It can be very foggy in the Gask Ridge, so
it certainly can. All right, we've still got a couple more to go. Mickey Van Lit asks, along the Rhine, especially in the Netherlands, very similar tower messaging systems have been found, but they were on, hang on, the English has got slightly out here, on the line of the limes, i.e. the defined border of the Roman Empire. Would you say the ones you were discussing were meant to be part of a limes, however temporarily, or was it just a well-developed road? I think he's referring to the Gask Ridge, in which case it is a possibility, isn't it?
Yeah, so which bit of the Netherlands was it?
It doesn't say specifically, he just refers to the limes.
So there's a really...
Near the Rhine, actually it does, along the Rhine. I apologize.
Yeah, it's a really complicated question. One that I can't really do justice to. There's a book called Roman Frontiers by David Breeze. It's quite a few years old now. It goes into a lot more detail than this, but essentially there are different types of frontier. A border is a legal border. and we're not really talking about that, but Romans had legal borders and a whole legal framework around those. Frontiers, as in the edge of the empire, it's very difficult to say in Scotland because it's the sort of physical end of something. You know, geographically, you're at the end of something. They're constantly pushing forward with it. So they may have a secure line. Was it a border or not? The Gasridge Towers actually have a series of forts beyond that on the edge of the Highlands. So it's very difficult. Some will disagree with me. It's very difficult to say what the edge of the empire was. What was it, a frontier or not? I think they kept pushing in the 1st century, and then they had to withdraw troops. So you have a series of forts, and then you have a series of 6 or 7 camps up onto the Moray coast towards Inverness, and then the line just stops because the troops were all withdrawn.
Yeah.
So that was never a frontier because they're camps, they're temporary, they're not solid fortifications. So I don't think we can really ever say where it was. I think it was constantly moving. And it wouldn't matter to the Romans because this is all a nonsense because they think they have a right to take over Scotland. They think it is theirs to do with what they want. So it doesn't really matter where you see a limit on the empire being, they'll go do what they want.
Briefly turning to crossings, tempted as I am to have a rant about the possibility of fords. You know what I think about that. Martin Doherty asks, has there been any metal detecting in river sediments where there may have been crossings?
Yes and no. Some sites are scheduled, so you can't metal detect. I've taken part in some research for a program on Sky History called River Hunters, where we did metal detecting with permissions. We had a professional archaeologist was employed. I was on as a consultant. We did River Hunters was at Ardoch Roman Fort in Perthshire. Huge site, lots going on there. We found nothing. We found 2 or 3 things that might be Roman. We found no metal. We found very few objects, Roman objects. Well, we found one fragment of a possible piece of samian ware. That was it. The problem is, there isn't a lot of rivers have moved, so a lot of the stone in Scotland can be a lot softer, and fluvial river movements in 2,000 years, the course of the river moves, a lot of the traces are washed away. For those sites that might have bridges and all that, there's been some work, but they're scheduled areas. They can't really be touched without full government permission. We have to plot where the finds are recovered from to tell the story. If you have a lot of finds in one area, it could indicate where the bridge was, if they were doing offerings, where they were dropping it. So doing things like river weight, the magnets where you draw over the river, dreadful, destroys the archaeology. We can't plot where it is. Going into the water and recording the actual find spot, we can tell a heck of a lot from that.
Yeah.
The reality is we don't think we have many bridge sites in Scotland. Very few of them. So there's a whole, you have to do educated guesses and all that sort of stuff.
I've just had one, I'll put this in now, because this has come to me directly, so it's not in the other lists, and so I don't forget about it. Oh goodness, actually, it's gone off. It was there. I'll come back to that. I'll find it again. The one directly in the chat, and several more have come in since, so I've completely lost it. And Jim won't be able to see that, unfortunately. Right, we have one from C. Lloyd. Now, forgive any of my terrible Scottish pronunciations. Is the fort at Carpow?
Carpow.
Well, that was close. Near Abernethy, only a late date, or was there anything along that part of the Tay contemporary to the Gasridge?
Assuming the Gasridge is 1st century, You've got the camp at Abernethy. There are two camps at Carpoo and the fortress. So Carpoo is a vexillation fortress. Not that you really need to know what that means. It means lots of soldiers. And it was a 3rd century site. It was probably the base of the Emperor Septimius Severus in Scotland. There are two camps very close to that. All of it appears to be 3rd century, possibly slightly earlier, nothing 1st century there that we have discovered. I would not be surprised if there was something else there, but you have got Abernethy Camp and it's right next door to Carpoo. So we may not be talking about forts, it may be camps here, and it may be that one. It may be one of the Carpoo camps that we've not dated, but I don't think we're going to find anything major there.
Okay. Paul Brunston. There is an unusual trapezoidal Roman fort of Epiarchum, Whitley Castle, near Alston, high in the Pennines, which was built by the 2nd cohort of Nervians, or at least they were there. I believe there is a similar Roman fort at Ardoch, near Perth, again trapezoidal with multiple defences. Is there a known connection between the two forts?
So, no, I think you've got slightly wrong there. Epiarchum, Whitley Castle, is trapezoidal, has some very beautifully well-preserved defences. It was probably there to guard lead that was being mined in the hills. Ardoch is traditional playing card shape fort. It was built in the 1st century. It was reduced in size and reoccupied in the 2nd century. I think where the confusion is very well preserved. So it's got very beautiful ditches, better than Epiarchum, and I hope the guys at Epiarchum aren't listening in tonight. But talking about trapezoidal forts, we do have some broadly similar trapezoidal forts in Scotland, very broadly similar, possibly not. Epiarchum's built probably slightly later than the ones in Scotland. So Loudon Hill that I talked about is slightly trapezoidal. Bochastle at Callander is more squarish, not quite trapezoidal. Crawford is also slightly trapezoidal. Crawford and Loudon Hill are incredibly similar in design. Unfortunately, Loudon Hill was partly excavated and destroyed in the 50s, but there are broad similarities between those two. They really build the fortifications depending on what the lay of the land is. So if trapezoidal fits into a natural platform, they'll build that shape.
Which is that's exactly the case at Whitley Castle. It's largely that shape to fit the land. It must have been most awkward to fit the internal arrangement into that shape. But the other point to make with fort design is that there are no two forts exactly the same anywhere. And whilst there are features that you can see in common, which may have been down to the units that built them, it's far from a precise science.
There's been a few people attempting to marry up designs of different sites together. It's interesting work. A lot of the sites aren't very closely surveyed to enable that to be quite a effective approach, but it's sort of the sort of thing that could be developed a lot further if someone was to do a PhD in it, and we'd learn a lot.
Yes, we would. There's an invite for somebody. I've found Graham Partridge's correct question while we've been talking. Again, pronunciation hopeless. Hi, can I ask how likely it would be that the camp near Glenluce?
Yep.
Oh, goodness. Would be
Glenluce,
used for a sea connection given its location. Thanks in advance.
Well, the thing is, we've got a lot of camps, mainly camps that are all near water's edge. And I think that's deliberate, guarding river access, most of them. Glenluce is near a slightly smaller river, but it is guarding a neck of land.
Yes.
It's got incredibly great views across the Solway for southwest Scotland. near the Rins of Galloway, so the sticky out bit of
Yes.
southwest Scotland is right in that little neck of land.
Mhm.
It possibly was there for sea access. It would make complete sense. It's much easier to move people by sea than it is by land,
Yeah.
if they're coming from coastal locations. It's first century. Yeah, quite possible, but we've not found evidence. But then again, a lot of these vessels would be beached, so you would never have a harbour structure built. It just wouldn't be needed for
Yeah.
a lot of them. We'll probably never be able to tell for certain.
Well, it's certainly interesting that the patterns that you've been describing this evening and relationships between fort locations, road locations, and rivers and river valleys, you do see the same pattern all over the place. It's not just in Scotland.
It's not, and I can confirm that there's been research going on in Wales very recently, found identical things that I've been finding. I was speaking to that person a couple of weeks ago, and it was amazing when we matched up. It's like, oh yeah, exactly the same there.
It
also appears to be the same in the 2nd century. I focused on first, but did dabble in second, and they're doing the same thing mainly in the 2nd century.
Yeah, to a lesser extent, you see it in Yorkshire as well.
Yeah. Your piece on the Pennines showed a lot of
that. This might be the last one. Is there any evidence of a vicus with any of the military forts, or were they occupied for too short a period? Good question.
Good question, and yes and no. There's very little evidence of settlements. I'll use the word settlement because vicus maybe implies a bit more of a village or anything. There's very little evidence, but the problem we've had, and this is for 1st century Scotland, although when you're talking about 2nd century, there's very few sites have it. But the reason is because archaeologists have tended to focus on the fort themselves. So they're looking at those 4 walls, everything within it. There's been very little work outside the forts, and we know this is an issue. There will be settlements. We've just never, excuse me, we've just never found them yet. But they will be out there. But we can't say, sorry, we can't say that for definite. So yeah, we don't have any that we know for definite. We suspect it because the army had a lot of hangers on. So people who supplied them with all sorts of goods and services, alcohol, blacksmithing, probably pottery, trading goods, maybe some X-rated services. All these people followed the army because it was a ready source of money. And it's probably not quite as violent as some of the sources tend to tell us. So it may not have been that dangerous for people to be following the army.
I'm just flicking through. But no, if there's anything else, Jim, can you send it through? But I don't think there is. I think that's just about it. Yep, that seems to be it.
Yeah, that's it. It's all the questions that I've got.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jim. Okay. Right. Well, all that remains is to thank Andrew again for a fascinating talk and equally fascinating Q&A. And thank everybody else for a good set of very intelligent questions. We're probably better than we've had for quite some time. So a good audience, and I hope all of you continue to watch the rest of the series. Thanks everybody for attending. And finally, thank you to the backroom team. Jim, you've just heard, but there've been a few others as well. Thank you to everybody. And with that, I heard a voice.
Thank you for having me. It was me.
Oh, Andrew. So I didn't realize who it was. You're more than welcome. And don't forget Andrew's book, because if you think the talk was fascinating, I'm sure the BAR is even more so. Just you might need to go to the bank and take a loan out. BARs. I hate to think how much it is. Anyway, with that, thanks again. And it only remains for me to wish everybody a good night.